You can identify another person's bias in seconds, then treat your own reasoning as the neutral standard. You can identify another person's bias in seconds, then treat your own reasoning as the neutral standard. Psychologists call this asymmetry the bias blind spot, the tendency to recognize the influence of cognitive and motivational biases more readily in other people than in oneself. That mismatch can persist even when someone knows the vocabulary of cognitive bias. It is not the claim that every accusation of bias is wrong, or that every disagreement is symmetrical. It describes a recurring problem in how people inspect the evidence behind a judgment. For another person, behavior is visible. Their selective examples, convenient timing, and changing standards can be examined from the outside. For yourself, something else is available: intention. You can search your own thoughts, fail to find a wish to distort the answer, and experience that absence as proof of objectivity. The name emerged from research by Emily Pronin, Daniel Lin, and Lee Ross. In a 2002 paper, participants read descriptions of familiar biases and rated how susceptible they and comparison groups were to them. Across surveys involving university students and travelers waiting at an airport, people generally placed themselves below others in susceptibility to many biases. The comparison group changed, from the average American, to classmates, to fellow travelers, but the self-other gap remained. The gap was not uniform across every human shortcoming. People did not always claim unusual immunity from problems that are easy to notice in oneself, such as procrastination or fear of public speaking. The asymmetry was clearest for influences that can operate without announcing themselves. One follow-up made the problem more uncomfortable. Participants first rated personal qualities such as how considerate, cooperative, and objective they were relative to other people. They were then shown an explanation of the better-than-average effect. Many accepted that other people's flattering self-ratings could reflect bias while insisting that their own ratings were accurate. Learning the category did not automatically make the current example feel like an instance of it. The bias could be recognized in principle and rejected in the first person at the same time. Another study examined self-serving explanations after feedback on a social intelligence test. Participants who received favorable results tended to view the test as more valid than participants who received unfavorable results. When they later evaluated another participant showing the same pattern, they could identify the influence of the score. When evaluating themselves, they treated their own conclusion as more objective. The important finding was not that the test revealed a hidden personality type. It was the difference in evidentiary standards. Another person's conclusion was compared with their outcome. One's own conclusion arrived with an internal explanation that felt sincere. That difference helps explain why introspection can become misleading. Looking inward can reveal what you consciously intended, what reasons you can articulate, and whether you remember feeling pressure. It cannot provide a complete audit trail of every process that shaped attention, interpretation, or memory. In 2007, Pronin and Matthew Kugler tested what they called an introspection illusion. Participants placed more weight on thoughts and intentions when assessing their own bias than when assessing someone else's. The asymmetry did not disappear simply when observers were given access to an actor's reported thoughts. The issue was not only unequal access. People treated introspective evidence as especially diagnostic when the person under examination was the self. Consider a hiring discussion. A manager favors one applicant and says the decision had nothing to do with the applicant's resemblance to a trusted former colleague. Internally, that may feel decisive. There was no conscious plan to reward familiarity. A coworker cannot inspect that intention. The coworker sees a repeated pattern in which familiar backgrounds receive more benefit of the doubt. Neither perspective alone proves discrimination in an individual decision. The bias blind spot appears when the manager treats clean intent as sufficient evidence while demanding that everyone else answer for observable patterns. The same behavior is judged through two different instruments. Naive realism adds another layer. People commonly experience their own view as a direct reading of events rather than one interpretation among several. If another reasonable person reaches a different conclusion, several explanations become tempting. They lack information, they are irrational, or they are biased. Your own perception does not feel filtered because the filtering is part of the perception. This does not mean that reality is unknowable or that all viewpoints are equally accurate. It means the subjective feeling of seeing plainly is not independent evidence that you have done so. Later research treated the bias blind spot as a measurable difference between people rather than a single laboratory curiosity. A 2015 series of studies by Irene Scopolidi and colleagues found a common factor across judgments about susceptibility to multiple biases. Scores on their measure were largely distinct from intelligence, cognitive reflection, self-esteem, and broad personality traits. People who believed themselves relatively immune were not simply demonstrating better general decision-making. In those studies, stronger bias blind spot scores also predicted placing less weight on advice from other people and responding less to a debiasing exercise. The authors described it as a metabias, a bias in recognizing bias. Those results require restraint. The early studies used modest convenience samples, including students and airport travelers. The later validation work relied heavily on online samples that were not nationally representative, a limitation the authors explicitly noted. A score from a study is not a clinical diagnosis, and recognizing the pattern in a conversation does not reveal another person's motives. The evidence supports a group-level tendency and meaningful individual variation. It does not establish that every confident person is biased, that introspection is worthless, or that disagreement proves a blind spot. The research also does not offer a magical state of being unbiased. In the 2015 work, people's awareness of common biases was not tightly linked to whether they committed them. Naming confirmation bias does not place someone outside confirmation bias. Expertise can supply better tools for checking a judgment, but it can also supply more fluent explanations after a preference has formed. The reliable protection is procedural rather than personal. Record a prediction before seeing an outcome, apply the same criteria to favored and disfavored cases, compare a decision with observable patterns, invite independent estimates, and make disagreement possible without requiring an accusation about character. These procedures matter because they change what counts as evidence. Instead of asking only, "Did I mean to be fair?" a decision can also ask, "Would I accept this reasoning from someone who wanted the opposite result?" Instead of treating criticism as proof that the critic is biased, a group can examine which information would change each position. External checks do not guarantee objectivity. They reduce the power of any one person's private feeling of objectivity. The bias blind spot is unsettling because sincerity offers no immunity. You may genuinely oppose favoritism, manipulation, or motivated reasoning. You may search your thoughts and find no trace of them. That search can be honest and still incomplete. Meanwhile, another person's bias remains vivid because you evaluate their actions from the outside. The final asymmetry is almost invisible. Their behavior is evidence, while your intention feels like a verdict. The next time someone else's distortion seems obvious, which standard are you using on the person in the mirror?